Well,
Go on, Alex.
well, do you think that the Tsar could have possibly used World War One to consolidate his own power, or do you think the only thing that it could have done was completely like tear down his rule?
That's a fantastic question, Alex, because actually in August 1914 there was a genuinely patriotic wave of sentiment in favor of the monarchy. And even, the Duma closed down business, saying we don't want to get in the way of the execution of the war with politics. The socialist movement was drastically weakened. And if only that moment of patriotism had been seized upon by the government, if only it had executed the war more efficiently, if only it had managed public opinion more effectively, your question's right. It could easily have used the war in a productive way to consolidate its regime. And, even in 1917, after the collapse of the monarchy, we have to bear in mind that a large element of the revolution was patriotic. The idea that we should have a revolution to fight the war more effectively. So as late as April, May 1917, there were patriots who thought that it was unpatriotic of the socialists to continue demonstrating. So, in other words, what I'm saying is that if we project forward 3 or 4 years from August 1914, we can see that the strength of patriotic feeling, the idea that the most important thing of all was fighting the war efficiently, could easily have given the initiative to the monarchy to consolidate its base. But there, the problems, I've already suggested what they are, were very badly managed by the Tsar and by the military command. They fought the war in outmoded ways. They weren't prepared in terms of technology, engineering, in terms of the infrastructure they required for trench warfare, the war of attrition that soon set in. They had a command which was divided between headquarters and the war ministry and the various front commanders. They didn't have enough military professionals to take up command positions once that first tier of senior officers was wiped out by the bloody battles of August, September, October 1914, and the NCOs who did step in tended to be much more radical in their political sentiments. And the government just was not prepared for the economic or social challenges of the war. So the munitions were farmed out to a coterie of big industrialists with close connections to the war ministry. The demands of more liberal industrialists organized through the War Industries Committee and the Duma to demand more competitive tendering were denied. That just drove the industrialists and liberals into the opposition camp. And perhaps most importantly of all, the government proved completely inept and inadequate for the task of the huge numbers of wounded, the tremendous challenges of medical relief, evacuation, the supply of the soldiers at the front with ammunition, with bandages, with food. And so with the government clearly so incompetent, the opposition steps in. The Zemgor organization, that's the Union of Zemstvas and Municipal Authorities, headed by the man who was to become the first Prime Minister of 1917 under the Provisional Government, Prince Lvov, steps in. And Zemgor, which has well over 100,000 people working for it in offices throughout the country, doing everything from collecting donations to help with the medical relief campaign, to people volunteering to pack up parcels, to evacuating soldiers. It was effectively, by 1915, an unofficial government. And it organized the opposition around that patriotic war campaign, around the medical relief campaign, the supply campaign. And so it had a sort of, not just shadow government role, but it had a moral and political authority to challenge the government. And so these Zemstva began to demand more authority, more accountability of the government, and effectively through the Progressive Bloc, which was a bloc of liberal Duma men and Zemstva men in the Zemgu organization, men in the War Industries Committee, they began to demand first an accountable government, in other words, that the Tsar appoint a government accountable to society, and then the more radical demand, which is really the roots of the February Revolution, they began to demand from 1915 onwards a public government. In other words, a government made up of Duma men itself. And that government ultimately was to become the provisional government. The provisional government established in February-March 1917 was effectively a Duma government whose origins are to be traced in precisely this liberal opposition that emerges as a result of the incompetence of the government. But, you know, perhaps above all, the thing that was to turn society against the regime was to lose the regime that opportunity of using the war for patriotic purposes. The thing that probably turned mass opinion against it above all were the rumors of treason at the court. The idea that the German woman, as she was known, the Empress, and as it was rumored, her lover Rasputin, were leaking secrets to the Germans, that military movements were already known to the German High Command because they had been told them by the Empress and Rasputin, that in the absence of the Tsar at the front, the German woman and Rasputin were effectively running the government, and the reason why Russia was doing so badly in the war was because there was treason in high places. Nicholas, meanwhile, was taking all the blame for the reverses at the front. But the ultimate damage was this idea that the government was not just incompetent, it was treasonable. And that was widely believed, not just by soldiers at the front, by people who, you know, sort of got the rumors, who bought the smutty pornographic postcards of Rasputin. It was believed by even the British ambassador, for example, believed it and reported it as fact to his government. The French ambassador, the same. And so you get this situation in the Duma of 1916 when Pavel Milyukov, who is to become the foreign minister in the provisional government, who is a liberal history professor with impeccable credentials, great connections to Western governments, he makes a speech in the Duma pointing his finger at all the inefficiencies and incompetencies of the government, and he says rhetorically, is this treason or folly? And of course he means it to be folly. He means it's just incompetence. But the fact that he used the word treason was taken by everybody to mean, oh, well, there must be treason if he says so. And so, as Milyukov said, his words sort of took on a significance he hadn't intended. They became a sort of rallying cry for revolution. And people said, well, Milyukov says it, there must be treason. And teachers, for example, they start printing pamphlets adding their own demands to Milyukov's list of inefficiencies, saying, yes, there's treason and there's folly and there should be better conditions for teachers. So in other words, what's happening is that a rumor mill is developing. The government's unable to really influence public opinion or what people believe, and it becomes generally believed, rumored, and accepted that the only way to fight the war patriotically and efficiently is to have a revolution, is to remove the treasonable government from power. So, yeah, it was, if you like, a huge opportunity in 1914, but one which by 1916 the government had completely squandered, and as a result, as your question suggests, had turned that opportunity into a much more likely revolutionary situation.